Welcome to Rooted and Ready from Annie's Project, where we bring you real conversations about risk, resilience, and the decisions shaping life in agriculture. I'm your host, Karisha Devlin. I'm a farmer and training and curriculum officer with Annie's Project. One of the most valuable assets in agriculture is land, but the agreements surrounding that land can sometimes be based on assumptions, verbal misunderstandings, or arrangements that have simply evolved over time. Today, we're talking about written farm leases. They're an important part of your farm business, particularly if you're involved in leasing land, either as a tenant or a landowner. A well written lease doesn't just protect the landowner or the tenant, it helps both parties communicate expectations, reduce misunderstandings, and build a stronger long term relationship. Joining us today is Mary Sobba, an agribusiness specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Mary works with agricultural producers and landowners on farm management topics and has extensive experience helping people navigate lease agreements and the conversations that come with them. Mary, welcome to Rooted and Ready.
All right. Well, thank you. Good to be here today.
So, this topic came about from a lot of questions that we've received um, from folks contacting us about potential future podcasts, but also from my experience when I worked with University Extension. When I think back to those days, leases were one of the main questions that came in, both from tenants and landowners. And sometimes it was just like, how do I put something in writing or things to do with the various parts of a lease. But also, there was a lot of questions that came in regarding conflict that had to do with a leasing situation. And, I think no matter what type of business you're in, leasing arrangements are an important part of that conversation. And in business arrangements, other than agriculture, you hear all the time, get it in writing, get it in writing. That is something that, is kind of a common business practice. However, in agriculture, it seems as if many of our farm leases have historically been based on a handshake or a verbal agreement. Why do you encourage producers and landowners to move toward having a written lease?
Sure. Well, first off, I'm going to back up with the history just a tiny bit
Sure.
and then go into it. But you mentioned everything needs to be in writing, and I would agree. I think part of the reason we still have a lot of oral or verbal leases is when leasing started, a lot of the times the land was either owned by someone that was wanting to cut back,
Hmm.
wanting to retire, or it was someone that lived in the small community where the land was. And now a lot of our landowners are far away from where the land is actually located. And so I've run into cases where the landowner has never even seen the land. And
Hmm.
so I think it's better and safer for both parties to have it in writing. So, I definitely recommend getting it in writing for sure. It's just clearer, and that sort of thing. And now you have to remind me, what's the next part of the question?
Well, that is a great first part, just asking, why they should move toward written leases. But maybe kind of expounding on that a little bit, you talked about how we have a lot of folks that are far removed from the farm. And, there's a huge gap of knowledge, a lack of knowledge there that can sometimes happen. So, can you give us some examples or some of the biggest misunderstandings that can arise in those type of
Sure.
situations, or maybe when expectations aren't written down?
Sure, sure. A lot of times, I think some things get assumed by one party or the other, and it's
Hmm.
not communicated well. And I can actually probably share some actual stories that happened that I've encountered over the years. And one was years ago, there was a farmer, a landowner, absentee, did not live in the area, and the land was being farmed by a farmer, and we ran into a wet year, which we may have this year yet, who knows? But
Hmm.
we ran into a wet year, and so everybody's scrambling to plant, and so mowing was not a high priority, to mow the ends of the ends of the field and the waterways and that sort of thing. And the issue became the landowner wanted to bring grandkids to the farm and had the RV and things, just going to have a fun family weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that wasn't conveyed to the to the tenant.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were hurrying and planning, and it caused a lot of hard feelings between the parties. And it could have easily been avoided. The tenant was going to mow, just didn't understand the landowner was coming. But that was a high priority because he wanted to share with his grandkids. Totally understand that.
Right.
But it was just a misunderstanding. So, things like that, if there's some communication in between, it would sure help a lot.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Something else that comes to mind, and I know, speaking of examples, that this is something that my husband and I have personally been involved in because we do lease ground from landowners. And we have one landowner in particular that he, when we mentioned something to him about getting a written lease between us, he almost felt like it was an affront, that he was
Mhm,
almost like taken aback, like, oh, we should be able to trust each other. And this is someone that does have some history with my husband's family, that he grew up across the
mhm,
street from my husband's grandpa, and he grew up with my husband's father and so forth. So I mean, there is like a kind of a relationship there. But one of the things that I would like you to kind of share with us is, if you do have somebody that's in that situation,
mhm,
and sometimes, in that particular example, even though I'm a huge proponent of written farm leases, this particular landowner does not want one between
mhm,
us. He wants it to be a verbal lease. He
mhm,
thinks, I've always done business with a handshake. That's how I want to continue. So sometimes you do run into those
mhm.
situations, and you just have to make the best of it, and trust and that situation will work out. However, how could a written lease actually strengthen a relationship rather than signal distrust? And in that situation, it kind of did with him. He felt like it wasn't us trusting him, or it would signify that we didn't, you know, that he wouldn't trust us. So if you were going to give me advice, if we were going to
Mhm,
walk backwards from that
mhm.
situation, how could I sell a written lease to him maybe better?
Right. That's a very good question. And one of the things I try to encourage is that um, explain it from the way of what would happen if something happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, you want to be sure that your land continues to be taken care of, and you want to be sure that whoever is whoever would take over at that point, that they understand what their responsibilities are. And the flip side of that is if something happened to the landowner and the land went to his heirs,
Mm-hmm.
um, they would want to know what they should be doing and what the terms of the lease were. So it's kind of a safeguard, you can approach it from the thing, well, what would happen to me? Not about what
Mm-hmm.
would happen to you, but what would happen to me?
Right.
I want to be sure that, the whatever our terms are, that whoever's farming it in my place, should something happen, that they
Mm-hmm.
would know what to do. They would
Right.
know when the payment is due. They would know, what they can and can't do and all those kinds of things. But I try to approach it from that side, is that it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like an insurance policy in some ways, is that they'll know the actual terms. They know what should be done. But I give the example of myself, and that way it doesn't feel like the cat's on their back, so to speak. And that
That's a
seems to
great
work.
point. Yeah. Great suggestion. I will try that. We'll try to get that conversation restarted with him. One thing that I really wanted to stress in our conversation is that it's not just about having something in writing, because one of the things that I would hear from people back in my extension days is,
Hmm.
oh, we do have something. We do have something. Or, somebody gave us a copy of a lease they use, and here, I'll show it to you. And you look at it, and it's just basically like two or three sentences, and it may have both parties' names. It may have when they want the rent due and how much, but or it may not, but it's just very vaguish. And so really that's not enough if you really want a
Mhm,
solid written lease. So
mhm,
let's talk a little bit about what are the essential parts of a lease that people really need to make sure that they have when
mhm,
they're putting something down in writing. And kind of just talking through some of them, and I'm going to lead it off by asking you a few questions. But I also want to open it up if there's, I know there's some additional things besides,
mhm,
the top five things that you
mhm,
should have in them. So thought we'd just kind of jump into that conversation now. So the first one that people really need to make sure is that they got the names of both
mhm.
parties and the property description. So, can we talk about why it's important to use legal names and not necessarily just the tenant and landowner? Sometimes you actually encourage adding other names or spouses' names. Can we talk a
Mhm.
little bit about that?
Sure, sure. You want to include whoever is in business, basically.
Okay.
So if it's a husband and wife, a husband and wife. If it's an LLC, the LLC needs to
Mm-hmm.
be. So it's whoever, whoever is in business. And you want to be sure to list each one of those. Now, if you get to the LLC or an entity structure, typically there's someone that has signing authority on behalf of the LLC.
Mm-hmm.
And so that should cover you. Um, um, but it's important because if something ever happened illegal wise, the actual people responsible need to be on that lease. And so it is important to have those names on there. As far as the description of the property, first, of course, you need the legal description. And then beyond that, to me, if my own property, the legal description doesn't mean too much.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us we have it written down somewhere, but typically when we start talking about farms, we'll say the Jones Farm,
Mm-hmm.
or you may even have like 123 County Road 403. So you may have a physical address depending on where it's located. But probably one of the more helpful things is to get an aerial map, whether you get it at USDA or whether you print it from Google Maps or wherever it might be, but outline where that property is and attach that to your lease. And then it's very clear where the boundaries of the property are. And I think that's helpful for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people to do that.
One of the next items that you really need to make sure to include in a
Hmm.
lease are the dates and termination.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, why do those matter?
Well, as far as the dates, of course, it's important to know, when the lease takes place. But from a standpoint for the tenant, it's important. A lot of times, the tenants will do some work prior to the planting season. So that could be putting on anhydrous. That could be doing some tillage work. It could be some weed control. So whenever they're making plans, and it could even be to know how many acres they have if they're upgrading equipment to know how fast they have to get across the land as well. But so it is important to know when that lease starts. And if you're changing tenants for whatever reason, it's important to know when it ends as well, so that tenants know when they need to be off the property as well. But it makes everything much clearer just to have it in writing. One of the things in a lease is usually there's a way to make amendments to them. There's a little
Hmm.
clause. So if something would change mid-year, there would be a way, if both parties agree to go ahead and make some changes as well.
This next area, it could be, it's a lot could be to it, depending on what type of rental arrangement that you
Mhm.
have. But let's start off with how and when payments will be made. Why is that important to make sure that's in there?
Well, there's a variety of methods, and if you could probably talk to five people and have five different things.
Hmm.
what's common in the Midwest may be different on, in the South.
Hmm.
And so keep in mind what I say. I'll probably be referencing more the Midwest in our area, where I'm at locally. But I think the principle behind it would be the same. Um, Most landowners will want some payment at least up front.
Hmm.
Um, just because they have expenses they have to incur, those kinds of things. Um, it is very common here to have two payments, one before planting and one after harvest. And that kind of seems to be the most common way here. Now, the percentages vary depending on your between the two parties.
Hmm.
Some it's everything from 100% to probably 25 to 50%. So there's a lot of variation there, and that can be negotiated between the parties based on
Hmm.
things. But it is important to know when that is, so that the landowner knows when to expect payment. If they're making, maybe they're going to be putting in some terraces and making improvements to the land. Well, they need to know when money's coming in to
Right.
kind of line up for their purposes. Plus, they have insurance and taxes and all those kinds of things. And then from the tenant standpoint, they need to know how to set up their operating note, maybe be communicating with their banker. Then they'll know what has to be done after harvest. It just makes it so much easier on the planning
Hmm.
side and the payment side for both parties to know how that's to take place.
What about length of lease?
Hmm.
What do you see? And again, as the good point that you made, it may depend on where you are in the parts of the country. It could be different.
Hmm.
But what do you usually see, both from a landowner and tenant perspective, when they're looking at the length of a lease, what they're wanting to have?
If it's a pretty much typical situation, most of ours are year to year, 1 year. And then there's a clause to somehow renew it. Now, that being said, this winter, I've been working with several people that are working on multi-year leases, and for a variety of reasons. It
Hmm.
may be that it's just easier to set it up on 3 years, and maybe review it each year. One of them I was working with is doing some special projects, some big projects, and the tenant is going to be helping. Well, so for helping, they're going to get a longer term lease. They're going to do a 10-year lease because it's a
Hmm.
big project. So, okay, that's fine. But they do need to be able to be some method of adjustment. Market prices may change. Your rental values may change. There needs to be some mechanism built in where if something needs to change, it can be changed, on periodically. Because typically, 5 years or 10 years is going to be quite a
A
ways.
lot can change. Yeah.
Yes, a lot can change.
So, do you recommend that it is should be reviewed yearly, even if it's a multi-year lease, that they come together to just kind of touch base about where the lease is at and if there needs to be any modifications?
I think it's a good idea to at least communicate, you know, between the price, rental values, the market prices, anything, we've had all kinds of worldwide things going on.
Hmm.
We can't get fertilizer in fertilizer is just shot up right now with the Strait of Hormuz. But, so I do think it's a good idea to review. You may not be no changes. I'm not saying
Hmm.
change every year at all, but I'm saying at least communicate with one another and at least review.
So we've hit on the basics, the
Hmm.
basic things that you need to have in a written lease. What are other things that you feel that are very essential that you would recommend a tenant or a landowner bringing into a written lease?
Hmm. One of the things I think that gets kind of forgotten sometimes is the right of entry. And the right of entry is where the landowner has the right to actually step foot on that property. To me, that's easier to understand from like if you think of like a renting an apartment, your
Hmm.
landlord can't just bust in the front door whenever they want. They have to get permission to come in. Well, the same is true on land, is that if you don't have some clause in the lease, you should not be on that property as a landowner, even though you own it. So what people will do is they'll put a what they call a right of entry clause in the lease agreement, which would give you the landowner the right to step foot on the property. So it might be to maybe just go, maybe they walk every morning for some exercise.
Hmm.
That's fine. They can be on there then. I mean, they can't tear up the crop, obviously, but they could walk on the end rows, or maybe they have a pond in the back. They want to go fishing, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So it gives them a right to be on the property. So that's one thing I think, needs to be in there for sure. Another one is hunting. That's a big thing here in the Midwest for a lot of people. And that is something, those hunting rights in this area, and it could vary state to state. I'm not sure because I haven't looked in some of the other states, but in Missouri, for sure, that hunting would go with the lease. The tenant would have the hunting rights unless it's in the lease agreement that the landowner retains those hunting rights.
Hmm.
That's a big one for here. That would be one thing. Let's see what else in there. There's several other things that would come into play as well, but those are two that I'm thinking of offhand, and you may be thinking of something I've forgotten as well.
Well, one that I feel like kind of comes hand in hand with the hunting in particular, because as you said, here in the Midwest, we have a lot of outfitters that are
Hmm.
renting hunting ground and then bringing parties in to hunt on them. So, one that comes to mind is subleasing.
Yes, yes, that is a big one, and typically that's not allowed unless the landowner is okay with it. But
Hmm.
there's usually a clause in a contract that, this you have to get special permission to do that and that sort of thing. So yes, that definitely is included as well. The other thing that brought up another thought as well is that if there's something on the farm that you want and you want to exclude it. Let's say you have an 80 acres, it's common to
Hmm.
have an 80 acres. Well, maybe there's a little corner that has a pond, and then along, or a little stream, and along the stream you've got some nut trees. And you've heard me talk about that before, is
Hmm.
if the landowner does not want to, if he plans to harvest nut trees or something along those lines, that needs to be excluded and clear in the lease as well. Otherwise, that would go with the lease as well if that acreage is included.
Speaking of other things on the farm, uh, in the past, I have ran into situations, again, when reflecting on a past career with extension, where there might have been a building on
Hmm.
the property or a grain bin on the property. Or in one situation, there was actually a tractor that was housed in one of the buildings. And sometimes there can be some gray areas between the tenant and the landowner on whether that grain bin comes with renting the ground. I can use that building. Oh, I can even use that tractor because it's sitting here. And so, what would you say in those kind of situations where there may be other things that could be used that
Hmm.
come with that farm ground?
If I was the landowner, I would definitely want to exclude those things in the farm ground lease. And you could have a separate lease for the facilities, for the grain bins, for the sheds, those kinds of
Hmm.
things. But here's the reason why I would do it that way, rather than just do a blanket, you have the right to everything, kind of thing.
Right.
But if circumstances change for whatever unforeseen things that may come up, there may come a situation where you would want to rent the grain bin to someone else. Maybe the crop that they're growing is not suited well for that bin for whatever reason. Maybe it's canola, and we all know canola can find the smallest hole and leak out on the ground very easily. So maybe it's better suited for corn or soybeans.
Hmm.
So if you have that bin separate, you could go ahead and lease it to someone else. But if it's included in the whole lease as a blanket, you wouldn't be able to do things like that.
Hmm.
I think probably your insurance agent would probably be happier if you had separate leases on those things as well,
Hmm.
because of the way insurance works. too. So I would suggest just pulling those things out and
Mhm.
just you could do a separate lease on them.
And it makes me think about our non-crop listeners. Maybe they have pasture ground or
Hmm.
hay ground.
Hmm.
So especially if you've got crop ground plus pasture plus hay ground, there it may be something else that you need to work out in those
Hmm.
situations, or maybe it's multiple tenants are involved in that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, 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 yeah. I haven't been mentioning pasture and the
Mhm.
on the livestock side of things as much, but yes, there's definitely leases for the livestock producers as well.
Mhm.
And sometimes those are almost getting more scarce to find pasture ground here than it is crop ground in some cases.
What are some other common mistakes you might see with um, people making with their farm leases? Anything else that
Pro-
comes to mind?
Well, I think we've probably touched on most of them, but I think it might not hurt to maybe reiterate them just a little bit. And
Hmm.
that would be, first of all, be sure and get it in writing. That would be the first one. Another one is be sure that all the parties are listed that are involved on both the tenant and the landlord side. So whether that's husband and wife or brother and sister, whatever it might be, make sure those parties are all listed. Um, the other thing is be sure that the lease is clear on what you want from both sides. And I would definitely encourage using a reputable lease. You can write one, yes. If you're going to write it, be sure you've got some reference that's reliable of what you need to be putting into that lease, um, just to make sure it's as good as you can do. And some people will go to lawyers. Some people will use extension resources from whatever state they're in. But make sure that you're actually, putting together what you want and have what you
Hmm.
want.
So for our listeners who, are really motivated by our conversation today to get something in writing if they don't currently have a written lease, what are some resources that they could go to?
Sure. Well, of course, I just mentioned extension. Extensions in most all the states, and whether it's at your local county office or maybe a regional office, if you call locally, I'm sure they can get you in touch with someone that can help you. A lot of extension across the country will have some sort of written publication or something you can download. Would be good resources as well. And then there is a website called aglease101.org, aglease101.org, that has put together a good library of templates for leases, and they also have booklets kind of explaining what kind of goes in each section of a lease. And those are very good resources. They're put together by, I believe it's like 13 states, several
Mhm.
states extensions went together and put this site together. And I think they've put together a nice set of resources. So that would be another good site. And then, of course, you could always go to a local lawyer that you've worked with in that
Mhm.
sort of way as well.
Great recommendations. The Ag Lease 101, what I particularly like about their website is it's very extensive as far as the different types of agriculture operations that you might have. There's different example leases, whether it's livestock, crop. Uh, there's also like some building and even an equipment lease, I think, if I remember correctly. So it definitely encourage people to check out their
Yes, and they
website.
do. One thing we haven't mentioned today is the share leases and the cash leases. We normally think of
Hmm.
cash leases, but they do have a specific share lease on there as well. So if you're, lease you prefer to do by share, then there's a template there as well.
Hmm. Well, closing up, I wanted to run through some advice that you can leave our listeners with. So, the first question is, what is your best advice for beginning farmers that are entering a lease agreement?
Okay, for a beginning, I would first and foremost is a written lease. I'm going back to that one, reiterate
Hmm.
that point over and over. Um,
Drive it home.
That's right.
Drive that
That's
one
right.
home.
And I'll underline that with communication.
Mm-hmm.
Be sure to communicate well with the landowner. And if you can't trust the party, probably the lease is not going to work long term. So,
Mhm.
ask around, do your homework beforehand. Make sure you're including in the lease all the terms that you need, that the landowner needs, the essential elements, all those kinds of things that are basic. But it's a good way to get into farming if you're a beginning farmer. You know, ask for help. Whether it's at the extension office, whether it's a neighbor or a relative, somebody that maybe has been leasing. I'm sure they could be a wealth of knowledge as well.
So, what's your best advice for landowners renting farm ground?
Well, my best advice, based on a lot of calls I get, is one is be sure you have a tenant. If you're wanting a long-term tenant, be sure you find one that you can trust.
Hmm.
And of course, they always say, how do I find that tenant? And if you're absentee, it's a little more difficult, but you can ask around. If you have neighbors that own land or anybody owns land in the area, they can probably give you five names pretty quickly, or
Hmm.
whatever it might be. But try to find somebody that you can trust. Um, Work it as a business arrangement. Make sure it's in writing. Um, and I think I'm going to go back to the communication. It's just like the tenant. Communication is the key things. Whatever your priorities are, if your priority is making sure your kids get the land, well, you want to make sure the land's taken care of.
Hmm.
If you want to enjoy that land yourself and be on it, make sure the tenant knows that. And so I think communication comes in both directions.
I think you're exactly right. And really, regardless of what type of relationship you're in, communication is so important. And when you get to assuming things, that's when you get in trouble. Kind of circling back to the example you shared at the very start of our conversation about the landowner who's wanting to come back with his RV and fish with his grandkids and everything around the pond is all grown up and weedy, and them having both parties being upset about that particular situation. So, Mary, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your wisdom and your experience with us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Today's conversation is a great reminder that a written lease is more than a legal document. It's a communication tool. Taking time to discuss expectations, responsibilities, and future plans can help landowners and tenants build stronger relationships and reduce risk for everyone involved. Thanks for listening to Rooted and Ready from Annie's Project. Until next time, stay rooted in what matters and ready for what's next.